Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. Each week we bring you the stories behind the artists and their songs. And this week we're delighted to share the musical journey of award-winning pianist, vocalist, and composer Laila Biali. The Toronto-based artist just released her latest album, an ambitious work called Out of Dust. During our discussion, Laila shares the stories of two very special people that helped to inspire the songs on this project. First, we go back to the beginning as Laila shares her early musical experiences as a child in British Columbia.
My parents are both first-generation Canadians, and my dad is an engineer. My mom was a homemaker, and she also played a little bit of piano, so we had a piano in the home. And my mom would occasionally, go to the piano and just play these beautiful church hymns. She was a hobbyist. She wasn't really that trained as a player, had obviously studied a little bit. But anyway, I would hear her play these hymns, and it just changed the space because she was otherwise, a very busy housewife and mother to four girls. I was the youngest of four. And I'm told that when I was 3.5, I climbed up onto the piano bench and started by ear playing the melody to Sesame Street. So exactly. And so my mom and dad at that point said, okay, we've got a child who clearly has an ear for music and an affinity for it. So they enrolled me in piano lessons, and thus began the beginning of my journey as a musician. And I would go to my piano teacher's house, and what I most keenly remember were two things. So we did this method called the Leela Fletcher method. And a lot of it was arts and crafts, which I loved because I was 4. So cutting out notes and rests and putting them on the page. And then the other thing was that she had this spectacular porcelain doll collection. She had a daughter who was a few years older than I. And on the way to the piano room, I would pass by this room filled with porcelain dolls. And so between those two things, my interest, remained intact. And then, pretty quickly, I really began to fall in love with classical piano. She would loan me cassette tapes and then ultimately CDs. Remember those?
I still use them on occasion.
And so do I. But I would listen to them at night when I was trying to go to sleep. And the music would just wash over. I especially loved Chopin and Debussy. And I would just fill my imagination, my mind's ear with music. And it had such a profound impact on me. And I wanted to be able to impact others in a similar way. And so that really fed my desire and my hunger to want to be able to play these ambitious songs, these beautiful songs. And so I advanced pretty quickly as a classical player. I got to what they call ARCT level, which is like 11, 12. By the time I was 12 myself. And then I had grand aspirations to become a concert pianist. I had my heroes, Evgeny Kissin and Anton Rubinstein, Horowitz, Philippe Autremont, the list goes on. But then I injured my arm when I was 15. We were in a car accident and we were rear-ended on the highway. And between that and a few other confounding circumstances, I wasn't able to use my hands, my right hand, fully. And so I segued to playing the, classical music that had been written exclusively for the left hand. But as you might imagine, it wasn't nearly as satisfying. Yeah. And that time frame in my life coincided with being introduced to jazz. I switched high schools and ended up at a high school in North Vancouver called Handsworth Secondary School, where this pianist you may have heard of had attended a couple decades before me, Rini Rosnes. And you've heard of Rini Rosnes. So my band teacher, Bob Rebliati, he was really the one who started feeding me jazz and introducing me to the music of Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett and Herbie Hancock, Bill Evans, and of course, Rini Rosnes. And because Rini had similarly a background in classical music, I could really relate to her approach to playing piano, because you could hear those classical threads. You could hear that classical influence. And it was a slower, kind of slow burn, my relationship with jazz, because I was still grieving the loss of my first love, classical. But sure enough, over time, I was won over, and ultimately did go to school for jazz, post-secondary school. I went to Humber College in Toronto. Because my arm was still a problem, I went as a singer, and I wasn't trained as a vocalist at all. So this was very strange for me. I felt a little bit like a fish out of water. But I discovered Norma Winston. I loved the music of Kenny Wheeler. And Norma Winston is a singer. Some might call her Norma Winstone.
Yes.
She's a British singer. And while the timbre of her voice wasn't necessarily the kind of thing I would gravitate towards as a listener, this vocalese style and just unique approach to jazz was fascinating to me as a singer and as a composer. And then I started getting into the music of Maria Schneider and, these other composers who had a little bit, again, of a classical approach to their music.
Regardless of the genre of music, what were the feelings? How did this music impact you?
It made me aware of a language and a way to experience beauty in the world that, this is before I was a singer, but that transcended words. And in that sense, I became aware of the capacity for music to transcend, the boundaries of culture and, worded language, we'll say. And it existed in another realm. And there was a very spiritual component to me. It would almost minister to me in a way that it's difficult to describe. My first year at Humber College as a college student was very difficult. It was my first year away from home. And I think because I was still struggling with my arm injury, I did feel a little displaced in the world and was trying to find my place as a musician. And so there were a lot of down days and down nights where I felt very lonely. And I would light candles in my room, in my little room, and I would play the Köln concert or the Vienna concert by Keith Jarrett, where he would just himself and a piano come up with these spontaneous compositions unfolding in real time before an audience. And it was like being at church for me. The music would wash over and I would experience healing. And I knew that music had the power to touch people and even heal them. That sounds kind of grand, but I experienced it myself. And so I believed that others would have a similar experience. They must be having a similar experience.
And there is a reason why at Simply Timeless we call it, your soundtrack for life. These are songs that speak to the good and the bad in life. And Laila, have you found that there seemed to be a song for just about any occasion, any emotion that you happen to be feeling at the time?
The songs that touch something deeper within me, and very often they are a little bit more reflective in nature. Although I love, the songs that sort of feel kind of epic and do span, perhaps the spectrum of emotions. Those more reflective songs have a bittersweetness. So there's a poignance, but also a real deep beauty that moves me, and I think can elicit emotions that are at once sad, but also, because there's beauty in it. There's this kind of joy as well. As strange as that may sound, that sounds a little bit like a paradox. Nature Boy is one of those songs for me. And that's actually a song that you could attribute to contemporary jazz, but it's a classic. I mean, because it reached, the talent of the great Nat King Cole, who really put it on the map. It has now been established firmly in what we call the Great American Songbook, even though it's not a show tune. And that song, it does make me feel all the emotions, because that final line, the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. I mean, it's so beautiful. It can make you feel that deep sense of longing, because obviously this is something we are for want of in our world in many ways. But then at the same time, could there be something, more powerful than that to elicit joy in us? I don't think so, because, regardless of faith background and creed, I think we can all agree that we believe in love. And that's what that lyric gets at.
I was thinking about Out of Dust, this latest album. You go from the fun and the zany, a song like Sugar, which the album is mostly originals. You even have a cover or two, including a song from Mr. Gregory Porter, Take Me to the Alley, a beautiful rendition of that. The title itself, Out of Dust, how did you come up with that?
On the one hand, I, was experiencing some real hardship in my life. It was bizarre because it ran in stark contrast to or with what people were perhaps observing online. So, I had won the Juno in Canada, which is like our Grammy. So that was a huge, huge milestone, career milestone. I was touring the world, but behind the scenes, I was struggling. I was struggling with my health. I had been diagnosed with what at the time were 2 autoimmune diagnoses. Now it's several, because anyone who knows about autoimmune disease knows that it's a bit of a slippery slope, or can be kind of a snowballing thing. And that was really difficult for me. And yet I would have to get on stage night after night and just bring the show, bring my energy, and didn't necessarily feel like it was appropriate to be letting people in on what was happening behind the scenes beyond, my immediate circle and family. So that was number one. I felt like I was kind of in the dust. And I'll circle back to that later. But so number one, my own struggle. Number two, as part of dealing just with life on a daily basis, but especially in times where I felt kind of beat down, I do a morning devotional or a time of meditation and prayer, and it usually involves some reading. So, I grew up in the church, and I'm still consider myself a Christian. So, biblical passages are a part of that time, but I also like to use a devotional app. And I have one I love called the Daily Practice Co. And one morning it was using that phrase, out of dust, and kind of referring to the ways in which this idea of dust has presented itself in Scripture, from dust to dust, right? And this cycle of life. And that got me a little bit intrigued with the phrase out of dust. And then finally, there's a band I love. They're an indie gospel band called Gungor. It's the last name, Michael and Lisa Gungor. And they're wonderful. And some of their songs have made it into congregational worship. So I had discovered a tune called Beautiful Things. And the refrain is, you make beautiful things out of dust, out of us, and then later out of dust. And I thought, my gosh, isn't that what the story of redemption is all about? And for those who maybe don't relate to that expression or that idea from a faith perspective, I just want to articulate how we see it in nature. In Australia, anyone who's been following the news knows that Australia had a real issue with wildfires for what seemed to go on for weeks, maybe even months. And there was a picture that went viral. And it was a picture of a totally obliterated, charred landscape, charred tree stumps, and just ashes. And then you could see poking out of that charred earth these brand new plant shoots. So out of the ashes, new life was taking shape and springing forth. And I've always believed that nothing in our lives is wasted, even unto death, as crazy as that may sound. And I thought that picture in nature was kind of a testimony to that fact. And so that is why I called the album Out of Dust, because while the songs explore more difficult themes, there is always my belief that out of the dust, something new will spring forth. After the darkness comes the dawn. You can kind of ascribe to it various metaphors, the light at the end of the tunnel, right, that we talk about, that's become a cliche, but we all know it to be true, right? And history has taught us that something good can and will come out of, I believe, everything. And I know that can sound trite and even perhaps a little tone deaf in times like these, but I don't know if I would be able to get through if not for that belief.
And the album touches on those points, those ideas, because in the liner notes, it's dedicated to the memory of two very special people, Wendy and Kitty. Tell me about them.
Well, Kitty, her story is a little more tragic. She's my cousin-in-law, and my husband, Ben, he and I were living in Brooklyn, not far from Kitty, and she was experiencing depression. We knew this, that she had was in a bout of depression and anxiety, but we never imagined that she would take her own life, and she did. And it took years to make sense of it, and to this day we struggle to, and of course we miss her every day. But while it initially kind of fractured the family, it ultimately brought many of us closer together, and we have wanted to continue to celebrate and honor her life in what way we can. And that's what the song Glass House is about. So in some ways, the redemption of her life and her story, even in her absence. And then Wendy was one of my closest friends, and it was the first person whose passing on I actually witnessed in the flesh. I was with her at her bedside in hospital when she was in her final hours, and I told her that I would dedicate the new album to her memory. At that point, I didn't know that I would call it Out of Dust. And I knew that I would write a song for her, but nothing had been written. And she actually asked if I would put together her memorial service, and her favorite song was Take Me to the Alley, which is why I ended up covering that song for the album. We performed it at her memorial. And so Wendy is another one whom, through the carrying forward of her story, we are trying to honor even after she's passed on.
How does Out of Dust tell your story from where you've been and where you are now in life?
Beauty for ashes. I've always believed that love will have the final say in our own lives and in the world. And I've had to fight to preserve that perspective when I've struggled and have kind of clamored or clawed my way back to the light when I've been in the depths of tougher times. I guess in a way the songwriting process and who I am as a musician is also the process by which I try and find that light. And so as I reach for it, and sometimes even struggle to see it, but believe that it's there. It's that line from Leonard Cohen's song Anthem. There is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. That's the place from which I create. And it's always been that way, on every album, but on this one more than ever, that was the predominant theme. And my hope is that these songs will help people find their way out of dust, out of the dust of what they might be experiencing right now during this pandemic and these unprecedented times. It's such a strange period in history. But there have already been some silver linings, the way in which people are coming together, not necessarily physically, but online, and searching for what good they can to get through the day. And that is what will carry us.
You do believe, as I do, that even as bad as things may seem today, hopefully in the next few weeks, things will get better.
They will. This too shall pass. I've heard a number of people say that, and I really believe that all things will be worked together for good. This too shall pass. And we'll have a new perspective. And while we might feel a little weathered, a little beat down, I think kind of like that refining fire we talk about, we'll shine a little more brightly, and we'll love one another, hopefully, a little more authentically on the other side of this.
Most musicians are in the same boat right now. You had mentioned getting ready to come to New York City to do a concert, to go on. Most musicians were planning to be on the road, going around the world for weeks on end. And all of a sudden, all of those plans, they just disappeared. So we're all going through a lot of the same struggles. A lot of us are at home trying to figure out what tomorrow is going to bring, specifically to our brothers and sisters who are artists. What would you say to them to help offer encouragement to them in their time of need?
There's no denying the need we all have to put food on the table and pay bills and to see basic needs met, which require resources. And in that sense, I want to encourage people to, on a practical note, experiment with live streaming. I know that it's an imperfect art, but the public want to hear your music, and they want to be able to partake in it, even if it's not, in a jazz club with beautiful sound and proper lighting. But, artists, I'm seeing more and more artists setting up means by which those who watch them live and are blessed by what they do can contribute. So that's just a practical thing that I would love to share. But perhaps the more important thing to say is keep going, because what you do now has more meaning than ever. People need music to make their day better, to help them, get through this time. So what you're doing is as important as ever. So keep going, keep creating music, write music. I think that as musicians, we experience healing in the very making of music as well. So that's important, to soothe your own soul. And you know what? I'm also going to say, if you're tired and you feel like you can't produce and you feel blocked creatively, you're not alone. There's this odd thing happening right now where everybody's like, well, we've got all this time on our hands, get productive. And I know that I myself have struggled. I'm a mom and a wife, and I have felt the impact of this, climate we're in profoundly, to the degree to which I have been unable to get creative, and so wherever you're at, give yourself permission, give yourself grace, but you will find a place to making music once again. And when you do, the world will be waiting.
Last question. Why music?
To me, to go back to what we were discussing earlier, music has the power to heal. It does. And it connects us, whether there are lyrics or not. It's a way that we experience communion and community. And I think that that's why, again, even in this new online paradigm, the capacity for music to transcend technology, it's there. And so it unites us, it brings us together, and it helps propel us forward. And also, at the same time, it enables us to really be in the moment. And those are two things I think we need right now. And in a way, to kind of cover all my bases, it also enables us to look back sometimes and remember, which is something that can be useful as we try to find our way forward as well.
Laila Biali, our guest this week during In Studio from Simply Timeless. Her album is called Out of Dust, and you can find out more information about it and her other works at lailabiali.com. That's Laila, Laila, Biali, Biali.com. Special thanks to Amanda Bloom at Crossover Media for helping make this interview possible. And our thanks to you for joining us in studio. I'm Jade Daniels. Have a wonderful week ahead.